Evening, folks. Welcome to Science Freedom Florida. My name is Ernie. Welcome aboard. Tonight we're going to be talking about the biology textbook. Again, it's chapter 10, page 289, and it's going to continue a little bit with what we talked about a couple of nights ago. I took last night off, just was a little tired, so I figured I would just take a break. But we're going to talk about 289, and we're going to talk about some vocabulary terms, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the other sidebars that the textbook has. So I hope you'll join us, either live or later with comments. If you have any questions, I'm happy to discuss anything scientific with you as we continue our examination of this indoctrination tool. The textbook here, and I'll post as I have been doing, I'll post up a picture of the actual page when I'm done with the live video. But the textbook here continues on with its look at the ideas that built up to Darwin's evolution, and in so doing, it defines three terms: catastrophism, gradualism, and universalism. And the catastrophism, it talks about natural disasters such as floods, volcanic eruptions, and stuff like that. And this caused species extinction, which is the point they're heading for. They're trying to show that species go extinct. And of course, we've talked about the definition of species and how that doesn't even really technically matter in a sense, because species going extinct and new species arising is part of the evolutionary model. And the other paradigm, species, is kind of an irrelevant term anyway. The catastrophism says that these species would go extinct, and then other species would move into the area and kind of take over the environment. They would be the ones that adapt to the new environment as they found it. Gradualism is mainly referenced here in terms of the geological process. The gradualism is that there's processes that are going on continually. They're very slow. They take a very long time to happen, like a river bed laying down sediment, lays down a certain layer, and then that layer gets compressed and a new layer forms on top of it, and this is something that happens very slow. And then you have something called uniformitarianism, which says that things continue on as they always have, and so it's kind of an expansion, I guess, of the idea of the gradualism. But they are distinct ideas. Gradualism doesn't necessarily have a specific time unit to it. The problem with uniformitarianism is that, number one, it's demonstrable that not everything has to continue on with this gradualistic idea over eons of time. You can have canyons, for example, that get washed out very rapidly by a flood, and there is ways to show that these rapid canyon formations are because of an overwhelming amount of water, and they form in a very short amount of time. And we have to look, and we have to say, all right, well, when we look at this particular canyon, or we look at that particular canyon, how did this one form? Was it rapid? Did it get washed out by a large flood? Did it get washed out by one of these catastrophic events, or was it something that happened gradually over time? And a fair amount of them, it's difficult to tell. The Grand Canyon is one of those. It's assumed that it happened over eons of time, but if there was a large enough flood, then you could have washed out the Grand Canyon very rapidly. So there's some problems with that. Tonight we're going to be a little bit short. I don't want to spend too much time because we've already talked about these, but I just want to talk about some of these sidebars in the textbook. The first one is in the upper right corner, the reading toolbox. It says the names of these geological theories can be broken down into familiar words. And then they go on and they give you some of the background, kind of like etymology, but not exactly. But the point I want to make is that, again, we're talking about geology here in a biology textbook, and it's very, very important that we understand that all of the sciences are connected. You can't disassociate one science from another and say, well, biology has nothing to do with geology, or biology has nothing to do with physics, or chemistry has nothing to do with physics. It's very difficult to disentangle them and isolate them and say, well, I'm only talking about biology, because that's not how it works. Biology, one of the very few laws, I've said this multiple times, one of the very few laws of biology is that it must obey all the laws of chemistry and physics. And here in the textbook, we're seeing that it's got to be connected to geology. And the reason that evolution has to be connected to geology is because evolution requires millions and millions of years. And if it doesn't have those millions of years, then it just can't happen. You can talk about all the little details and all the little DNA things, or all of the little fossils that you find, or any of the little minutia of these facts that the evolutionists put forward. But if you don't have the millions of years that they call for, it's a completely moot point. And so they have to build on geology. That's why this is mentioned right here at the beginning. It's why it's mentioned constantly, is you have this connection. And if you can't make that connection, if there's no millions of years, there's no evolution. It's just that simple. And so I wanted to make that connection here, the way that the textbook is doing it. So this is their own words. And then, of course, they come back to it a little bit further down, connect to scientific process, and they have to come back to this term theory. It says, recall from the chapter Biology in the 21st Century, this is an earlier chapter in the textbook, that in science, the term theory describes a well-supported explanation that incorporates observations, inferences, and tested hypotheses. So again, we swing back the other way, that the theory is this big model, this overarching idea that contains a bunch of smaller things, which is not correct. That's not the way a theory should work at all, in terms of the definition, because if it becomes large and unwieldy, then a theory is not testable or what we call falsifiable. You can't falsify it, it's not science. These are the arguments that they make. If something is not falsifiable, they'll talk about you can't put that in a test tube. And then the textbook says that this is supported by observations, inferences, and that's really powerful, and tested hypotheses. And so I have to ask again, in terms of evolution, what tested hypotheses do you have that directly draw the conclusion that evolution must be true? It's one thing to have a number of hypotheses that give you kind of a non-essential building block of your model. But it's another thing to say, all right, we tested this hypothesis, and it our hypothesis, and it doesn't relate to the conclusion. There's no drawing of a conclusion that comes from whatever hypothesis they're peddling. And so the models that they're trying to build, the evolutionary model that they're trying to build, is not built on actual tested hypotheses. There's none there that actually demand that conclusion. There's a bunch of hearsay, circular arguments, and assertions that don't have the proof that they need. Plus, again, they don't have the time. They just don't have the geological time that they say they do. And I've shown in a number of videos on YouTube why that's not the case. Again, my favorite argument is the blue star argument that shows that the universe can't be more than 1 million years old. And of course, we can argue down from that to something more. But I do want to touch on, before I head out here, hi Tia, welcome aboard. Glad to have you here. I do want to touch on this idea of inference, and it's a super powerful idea. I actually like that the textbook is talking about this idea of inference, and I want to do a little bit of a vocabulary lesson here quickly, and then I'm going to talk about why this is powerful. There's a difference between implication and inference. Implication is what the sender of a message does. If I imply something, then I am passing on information that I don't explicitly state. And then if I infer something, that's what somebody that's the receiver of the message does. I draw a conclusion based on what's been said to something that hasn't been said. So, and I teach this in my class all the time with the kids, and I say, all right, let's talk about what that means. If I were to say that, and what I'll normally do is I'll have two kids stand up. I'll have the tallest one in the room, and then another one that's relatively tall stand up, and then I'll have the tallest one sit down, and then I'll have like some short girl stand up, and she'll obviously be very, very much shorter than the guy. And I'll say, all right, now everybody sit down. And then I'll say, what conclusion can we draw about the person that sat down first and the girl that was standing up last? And we haven't directly observed. And so there's an implication there of the evidence. The evidence implies, the writing implies, and then the observer infers, they draw a conclusion. The reader infers, they draw a conclusion. And so it's very important to understand that the evidence that we find, the fossils that we find, the rock layers that we find, the anatomy during gestation that we observe, these are all things that everybody sees. But the inferences that we make are quite different based on the paradigm that we start with. And that's hugely, hugely important. But I think what's even more important is that the biology textbook here, and I wish more evolutionists everywhere would understand and allow that science isn't just about the thing that you can directly observe and experiment with. You know, it sounds weird me saying that, but that's extremely important, because if you can draw conclusions from what is observable to things that you can't observe, then our ability to understand the universe expands well beyond what is simply observable. And I'm going to kind of leave it at that. But the other side of that coin, is if you take away the inference, you take away the ability to reason from what's observable to the things that can't be observed. Like, nobody saw the Grand Canyon formed. Nobody. Okay, nobody was around when it was done. They certainly weren't on location whenever it was formed, but nobody observed it happening. And so we have to draw conclusions from the evidence that we can observe about its forming. Well, evolution is the same way. Nobody has seen the rocks to man evolution that's been alleged. Nobody has seen single-celled organisms evolve into the diversity and complexity of life that exists today. For them to even have hope of proving their model to be true, they have to allow the ability to draw conclusions from evidence to things that can't be observed. And if you take that away, you take away the ability to reason to evolution, because it's not observable. The macroevolution it just takes too long. Nobody today, anywhere, is ever going to observe anything turning into a different kind of creature. I'm not talking about a different species, because again, species is not a great term to begin with. But I'm talking about a whole new kind of creature, like evolution proposes. Single-celled to multi-celled, or multi-celled to complex organs and whatnot. Thank you, T. I appreciate that. And so, since it's not observable, since nobody's ever going to observe that, they're stuck. And so they have to allow for that inference. And if they allow for that inference, then they allow for something. They allow for something that is something they don't want to allow for. And then it's kind of a catch-22 for them. So I actually like the honesty of evolutionists who do acknowledge this fact that you can infer from evidence to things that you can't directly observe, because then we get into the origins of the universe. Yeah, it's not a religious argument at all. In fact, none of my videos are founded on religion. They're founded strictly on science. Tia, I'm talking physics, I'm talking chemistry, I'm talking biology, and I'm I'm not purposefully leaving religion out of it, but I'm not really focused on religion because the point of these is to show that we can show the textbooks to be wrong based on science. So, um, right, yeah, yeah, we can't, we definitely not morally. And that's a good point to bring up is, if you go back to the real reason that Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, or even look at the full title of the thing, it was inherently um, racist. He was looking for a way to prove that whites were better than everybody else. That was the main impetus of his textbook, or of his work. And so yeah, I have problems with it morally as well, certainly. So and I actually have a video up on YouTube that talks about this and talks about the relationship of Hitler to Darwin, because the assertion was made back at the February um, board meeting by David Campbell that Hitler was not an evolutionist, and that's just not true. He was a die-hard evolutionist. He was such a purist in evolution that he actually went around and he burned books that were false versions of evolution. Anybody who came up with their own non-Darwin version of evolution, he would have that book burned. But he hired so many people who were evolutionists to teach in his schools and stuff. So I totally agree with you there on that. So anyway, that's all I have for tonight. The early voting for Clay County School Board is over. Um, we got to go out one last time yesterday and hold up signs, and had some interesting conversations on that day by being out there. And then the kids got to play at the park, at the library, and so that was fun. And then we spent all day today as well, just hanging out and playing with one another, and got to worship a little bit. But that's all I've got. We have one more day. One more day is August 28th. It's Tuesday. It is the actual election day. You need to get out to the election places. You have to go to your specific precinct location now. If you have not voted yet, please get out and vote. Ashley Gilhausen, Betsy Condon, Latanya Peterson. Did I say that right? Yeah, I'm a little tired. So Ashley Gilhausen, Betsy Condon, Latanya Peterson, and these ladies are the ones that really want us to be able to think critically, want our kids to be able to think critically. They're the ones that truly support the teachers, and they're the ones that really need your vote if we're going to keep Clay County the type of county that it has been historically, and needs to be going forward. So thank you guys for watching. Thank you for sharing this as much as you can. It's very important that you share this, get this out, and spread the word. And above all, guys, keep on learning.